the Duke of Wellington. He is most notorious for his victory over Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815, and his brief stint as the British Prime Minister from 1828 to 1830, and then once more in 1834. Perhaps no story better encapsulates the Duke of Wellington as a person better than how he got his nickname, the Iron Duke. While this monomer originated from his victories over French forces during the Napoleonic Wars, it gained notoriety in 1830, when British citizens hated his policies so much that they threw rocks into his windows, to which Wellington put up iron bars, thus becoming the Iron Duke. But who was the Duke of Wellington? Who was the man who gave his name to the beef Wellington and the Wellington boot? Arthur Wellesley was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1769 to a fairly aristocratic family, the Earls of Mornington. While they may have been aristocratic, Arthur was the sixth child and therefore had no right to their wealth. Wellington's mother, Anne Wellesley, the Countess of Mornington, absolutely despised him. She regarded Wellesley as dull and uninteresting. Wellesley received his earliest education at Brown's Preparatory School, where he was notably unremarkable, spending far more time playing the flute than actually studying. Eventually, Wellington was forced to enroll in Eton College from 1781 to 1784, where he was regarded as very unsociable and having no tune for scholarship. Following this, in 1786, Arthur was enrolled into the French Royal Academy of Equitation and Angers, where he progressed significantly, becoming both a good horseman and learning French. While his mom originally regarded him as food for powder, an old-school term for cannon fodder, she would soon be impressed with his progress, which encouraged her to purchase a commission for him in the British Army in 1787, where he was one of the 41st Foot. Within 9 years, he became promoted to lieutenant colonel, a process that usually takes around 22 years, a testament to his skill. When he turned 21 years of age, he joined the Irish House of Commons, being quite introverted and quietly voting Tory. Just like most band kids, he was often unable to convince any woman to dance with him at any of the parties hosted by the Commons, with one story finding him returning home with the musicians rather than a lady. After being promoted to lieutenant colonel of the 33rd Regiment, he became a perfectionist, making an effort to further his career as much as possible. It was at this time when he met his future wife, Catherine Kitty Pakenham. During this meeting, he promised to marry her, but Pakenham's family, aristocrats themselves, denied it because Arthur was completely broke. Eventually, he would marry her after returning to Europe in 1805, roughly 10 years after first meeting her. While he found her absolutely jaw-dropping at first, he remarked to his brother that she has grown ugly, by Jove. Due to this, they lived apart and spent most of their lives away from each other. Kitty had become incredibly depressed as Arthur would begin affairs with other women. Despite this strained relationship, he would have 2 children with Pakenham, Arthur and Charles Wellesley, neither of whom had much significance in history. Eventually, revolution would break out in France, with head chopping galore taking the center stage in Europe. As a response, Britain sent a force of 10,000 men to the Netherlands, a group that Wellesley was a part of. This campaign was an absolute failure, with France winning at nearly every conflict. Wellesley was later quoted with saying, "At least I learned what not to do," and that is always a valuable lesson, in regards to his time in the Netherlands. After such a disaster, his regiment would be sent to Calcutta in India in 1797, where his brother, Richard Wellesley, now Lord Mornington, was the Governor-General of India. During this period, he changed his name from the easy-to-spell Wellesley to the much more difficult traditional spelling of Wellesley, simply because he felt like it. In India, Wellesley would gain infamy as a talented colonel of the British Army. His successes were notorious across the continent, with his victories in the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War and the Anglo-Martha War being of note. In particular, the Battle of Say cemented Wellington as one of the most competent generals of his day, which became pretty clear when looking at a record of all his battles. For this, he became knighted. After this, France once again decided it was time for another war. A little-known general by the name of Napoleon decided he was going to ravage the continent and reshape Europe in his image. With this, Arthur was recalled back to Europe after his brother's career as the Governor-General of India ended. On his voyage back to England, Arthur took a stop on the island of St. Helena and stayed at the Briars. In 1806, he was elected Member of Parliament for the Rye, and within a year he was appointed the Chief Secretary of Ireland. Despite these political commitments, he also served as the commander of the British Army in the Peninsular War, where he was given a mere 44,000 troops to combat the 360,000 French and Spanish troops in Portugal. Even with these overwhelming odds, Wellesley would routinely face larger French forces and come out victorious. his adaptive style of warfare and defensive tactics are still studied by military scholars to this day. Arguably the most important victories of Wellesley's career in the Peninsular War were the Battle of Salamanca in 1812, which saw the liberation of Madrid for about 5 minutes, and the Battle of Vitoria in 1813, which was essentially the end of the conflict. For his victories in Spain and Portugal, he was granted the title the First Duke of Wellington in 1814. However, the most famous battle of his career is undoubtedly the Battle of Waterloo, where Wellington led an army of 68,000 men composed of a ragtag team of the British, the Dutch, the Hanoverians, and some other random Central European states against Napoleon's army of 73,000. To this, Napoleon remarked to his generals that just because you have all been beaten by Wellington, you think he's a good general. I tell you Wellington is a bad general. The English are bad troops, and this affair is nothing more than eating breakfast, a phrase that would soon come back to bite him. At the start of the conflict at 10 a.m., Napoleon was on the offensive, but Wellington's experience in defensive warfare with a smaller force actually played to his favor, having the battle shift towards a British success by 4 p.m. At 4:20, Wellington remarked, "The battle is mine, and if the Prussians arrive soon, there will be an end of the war." And the end of the war it was. Napoleon was soon ousted from power and exiled again to the island of St. Helena, staying in the exact same building that Wellington stayed at 10 years prior. A testament to Wellington's character, he wrote to the Westminster government that all British soldiers participating in the Battle of Waterloo should receive a medal, a request that was granted with the 1816 Waterloo Medal being granted to all participating ranks. When Wellington returned home to England, he was formally honored, given an estate in Hampshire, and given a fortune of £400,000, which in modern money is a lot. After this monumental success, Wellington celebrated by sleeping with two of Napoleon's mistresses, an Italian opera singer Josephine Grassini and the actress Margarine Josephine Weimer, the latter of which remarked that Wellington was far stronger than Napoleon. I suppose artillery barrages aren't the only cannons that Wellington was very skilled with. Upon returning to Britain, Wellington decided that it was time for politics. He joined Parliament as the Master of the Ordnance and went on several diplomatic missions to Russia. In 1822, an 18-foot-tall statue of Wellington was installed in Hyde Park, with his face being plastered on the body of the Greek hero Achilles. The statue of Achilles was commissioned by a patriotic upper-class society known as the Ladies of England, and was a fully nude statue. This nudity caused such a public outcry that a small fig leaf was added over his noble blade. In 1828, King George IV requested that Wellington form his own government, leading to Wellesley becoming the British Prime Minister. During his tenure, he passed the Catholic Emancipation Act, which gave almost full rights to Catholics living in Britain. A common misconception is that he did this because of the pressure from the Catholics in England. However, he was actually considering this bill since the early 1790s, most likely due to his time in a very Catholic-heavy area of Ireland. He was so dedicated to Catholic emancipation that he challenged Lord Winchelsea, an opponent of the bill, to duel over it, although both intentionally missed their target. Other than this single piece of legislation, Arthur was incredibly conservative in his time as Prime Minister. Not like the modern-day conservatives in government who spend their time arguing over books in classrooms and spending their days on Twitter. Rather, Wellington spent his time arguing over whether more men should have the right to vote. He said no, and opposed the Reform Act on multiple occasions, which led to the aforementioned story of people throwing rocks into his windows. In 1830, Arthur Wellesley was removed from office of Prime Minister by a vote of no confidence due to his rejection of the Reform Bill. Arthur would serve as Prime Minister again for a single month in 1834, but this would be the end of any major political significance. He would continue to serve as the leader of the new Conservative Party until 1846 in the House of Lords, when he would eventually retire from politics. Arthur would once more become the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, and his last public military act would be to organize the defense of London during the 1848 protests in Europe. In life, even with all of his achievements, he was an incredibly humble and caring person. He would rise early and continue to sleep on a military camp bed until his death, despite his great fortune. When his wife died in 1832, even with their incredibly strained love, he still felt a great sadness for her death and never remarried. Upon her deathbed, she put her arm up Wellesley's sleeve to see if he was still wearing an armlet she had once given him. She found it, as she would have at any time these past 20 years, had she cared to look for it, her husband later stated. How strange it was, he went on to say, that people could live together for half a lifetime and only understand each other at the end. Ultimately, Wellington would die of a stroke at Walmer Castle on September 14, 1852, surrounded by doctors. The day prior, he had happily spent his time with his grandchildren, leading to the assumption that his death was not as tragic as once believed. He would be given a state funeral 4 days later at St. Paul's Cathedral, an honor reserved only for monarchs. Thousands showed up for his funeral, with Queen Victoria paying her respects to the fallen Duke. In spite of his controversial life, Wellington died a hero amongst the British people. His legacy as Britain's greatest military commander still resonates among the British people even to this day.